In this presentation, we define the words that we use to describe risk. My name is Bert Stewart. I'm a research geologist. I used to work for the Geological Survey of Canada and on risk projects. This is part of a series on risk management. Risk management particularly for reducing the potential of disasters in cities. So risk is the probability of a negative consequence to something you care about. And if it's not something you care about, it wouldn't be a risk. Let's create a consequence. So we're going to take this cup, I'm going to put it on the floor, and we'll crush it. So now we've created a consequence. So there, we've created a consequence. We've crushed the cup, and it's to a coffee drinker, that would be a disaster. We've lost our cup, and consequence you can measure by the amount of damage or the amount of loss or the amount of harm. In this case, the replacement cost of the cup, the time involved in doing that, those would be all measured as a consequence. And then consequence itself is this event that created it can be broken down into three different parts. And they are the intensity of the hazard event that caused all this, the exposure of this cup to that hazard event, and then the vulnerability of the cup to that particular hazard event. So those three different measures. And we can show how those work. We'll go through those three parts: the intensity of the hazard event, the exposure to the hazard event, and the vulnerability to the hazard event. So we can have the hazard event happen, there's nothing around it, and we can change the intensity of it by just stomping harder. So we have a low intensity to a high intensity event. The hazard itself is the potential of my foot to stomp without the event happening. So that's the hazard. It exists even though my leg isn't moving. The event is when that hazard is realized. So it goes on. And we can then show the effective exposure. So we can place the cup near the hazard event but out of the line of the hazard. We can make the hazard happen. There is no consequence because the cup is not exposed to the hazard. We can move it closer to the hazard. We cause the hazard to happen. Because it was partially exposed, then we have partial consequence. And if it's fully exposed, then we would get a full consequence, so the crushing of the cup. So that's the hazard intensity, the hazard event, and the exposure to the hazard event. And now we can talk about the vulnerabilities, the two different types. Now I have a metal cup and a paper cup. And so the paper cup is more vulnerable than the metal cup, and we'll demonstrate that in two ways. First, we'll put the paper cup down and we'll use a low intensity event. At low intensity, the cup is not vulnerable to that hazard. If we increase the intensity a little bit, the cup is more vulnerable to that higher intensity hazard event. And then we can increase the intensity even further. And we have, again, full consequence at that intensity level. At a high intensity, like we did for crushing this cup just now, we can use the metal cup instead. We can stomp on it and nothing happens. So this metal cup has a very low vulnerability to that intensity of hazard, whereas the paper cup had a very high vulnerability to that intensity of hazard. So the vulnerability of the cups stays the same, whether they're exposed to the hazard or whether they're not exposed to the hazard, because the material properties is the same. So if I move them in line to the hazard, they'll get crushed or not crushed. So the paper cup exposed to the hazard will get crushed, and the metal one will not get crushed, because their vulnerability stays the same no matter where they are. So recapping, risk is the probability of a consequence, a negative consequence to something you care about. And the consequence results from three different factors. It's the hazard event, it's the exposure of what you care about to that hazard event, and the vulnerability of that thing you care about to that particular hazard event. So a high vulnerability or a low vulnerability. So with those terms, you'll be able to follow through the risk management series dealing with reduction of disasters in cities.